Okay, coming to you live from my grandma's bedroom, hence the decor. Okay, so this we're history, American economic history, first century, basically from late 1700s up to early 1900s. That's the course. Where we need to start, though, at least this first week, is just an overview of economic growth. Just kind of like backing up and just thinking about economic growth, because ultimately this is economic history class. What we are going to be concerned about is kind of the miracle of U.S. economic growth, where essentially it starts as a backwater. When we end this class, it'll be a world power, and the engine of that is the American economy. Now, I think most classes, when they talk about American history, this is all in the background. Like nobody, we take a political science class about American politics, or you take just a regular history class. It's just kind of, hey, the American economy is just going along. It's just growing, but that is not the norm. Like the American economy basically grows 2 to 3% a year since its founding. That's not the norm. Economies stagnate. Economies go back. Countries have extreme growth periods. Essentially, most countries, they are kind of go along. They're not really, that rich, and then all of a sudden they develop, and then they kind of get onto the path that the U.S. is on. The U.S. is kind of like this weird case where it just kind of always had steady economic growth, and so like it's just there in the background for most classes. They don't think that much about it. But this is the well, it's the most important thing. It's the most important thing for this class, since it's an economic history class. But it's very important. The fact that your economy is growing by 2% a year may not seem like much, but that's compound. That's like if your bank, or you have $100 and you get 2% more each day, you're going to be rich very soon. Plug it into a calculator. And so this is how the U.S. can go from a backwater, just 2% a year, 2% a year. All of a sudden, they are the richest country in the world by the turn of the 20th century. Okay, and so this is, like I said, this is not the norm. And so, what is the norm? Let me jump on the slides here. Okay, so this is world history. Okay, this is what world history looks like. Again, we kind of like take what we have for granted. We're up here, we're up here on this graph, right? This is what's called the hockey stick graph, because basically the whole world changes, around here. But for most of human history, there's no growth. For most of human history, humans are subsistence beings. Life is the Thomas Hobbes quote, like life is cruel, brutish, and short. Essentially, people there's somebody who's up here being cruel to you. It's just brutish. There's violence, and you're gonna die young. Okay, and your subsistence, you're barely making enough to survive. All right, you're literally barely growing enough food or have enough food to live on. Okay, and that's most of human history. All right, your hunter gatherers. Okay, then there's the agricultural revolution, and now there's some like early civilizations built around farming. Okay, that's all great, but we're still not really even getting enough calories to feed ourselves. Everything changes in the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. Few countries break out of this world, this subsistence world. Build on that, build on that, build on that, and all of a sudden, just shoots upwards. So history is not linear. Like what this graph is telling you is history is not, there's not like a steady improvement. Now, what I just told you, American history is, it's very kind of going up, going up, going up, going up, going up. But there's this big transformation. Now, the US gets founded basically at the beginning of this transformation. And so it's very just important just to think a little bit about economic growth, because there is this flip that gets switched. And it kind of leads to all, the wealth and kind of the things that we enjoy today. So it's just like, I'm going to take the first week just thinking about it. Okay. And for those of you that have taken the next part of this course, kind of like got offered backwards, I guess, because of the pandemic. But yeah, so this will be a bit of a review, but it's just, this is a good just thing to have in your head. All right, so for most of human history, it's a zero-sum game. Okay, and this is important because like a lot of our biology, a lot of our evolution is formed in this time period. We're living in a finite world. We're living in a zero sum. There's basically one resource, land. land, or if maybe if we're hunter gatherers, there's like access to, the hunting ground. Um, and basically, if I take something, or if I'm growing something on that land, you can't grow it. And so it's zero sum. If I have it, you don't have it. And a lot of our thinking about the economy still exists in that zero sum world. We kind of view everything as zero sum. Well, if that person is rich over there, they must have taken it from somebody. Okay. That's not always the case. In fact, most of the time it's not the case. All right. And so there's one resource, land, and this is kind of how humans exist. Okay, and this kind of informs a lot of the dynamics in this pre-industrial world, where there's lots of wars, and those wars are over land. All the different tribes or all the different groups are constantly trying to expand. You have more land, you are richer, you have more access to food and other resources. This all changes though, okay? But this often informs like our mindset. All right, and so you have this guy Thomas Malthus, who's an economist, or whatever. I don't know if he was technically an economist back then, but you would think of him as an economist now. And so he's like looking at this, and he's like thinking, he's like, yeah, this is the way the world works. We have this fixed resource land, and since we have that resource, and if I'm getting stuff, you aren't getting stuff, it would be a lot better if there were less of us. So basically what happens, he comes up with this kind of Malthusian cycle theory where, we go through these periods where, all right, we're rich because there's not that many of us. Then because we're rich, we live longer and we have more kids. Now we have more kids, the population grows. Okay, now there's less food to go around. Now we're poorer. Now we're poor, we don't live as long. There's like pestilence, there's disease that happens. Lots of us die. Then we get richer. Okay, and we just kind of we go through this cycle. And so basically he kind of observes this. He like kind of looks at history and he's like, yeah, this is what's going on. So what we should do is lower the population. So he's basically advocating for population control. Aren't he's parodied in Dickens is actually, when he did the Christmas Carol, he's like parodying Malthus with Scrooge. If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Okay, now what's going on in this graph? This graph shows you the Malthusian world. All right, this is data from England. And so, say we start here, start in, the 1280s. Okay. What's going on? We have a pretty big population for this time period. All right. We're at about 4.9 million, something like that. And the real wages are low. We're relatively poor. All right. Then basically the population grows. We get a little poorer. Then the population starts to decline and we get richer. All right. This is the Black Death. Okay. Black Death comes along, kills a bunch of people, half the population in some by some estimates. And so all of a sudden the population goes down from 5 up to when we get to the 1490s, we are basically, less than half that. All right. And we're almost double as wealthy. This is for England. Okay. And this is basically Malthusian dynamic. You can either have high population and low wages or low wealth, low standard of living. Sorry, low standard of living is the correct word. Or you can have low population, high standard of living. This is the Malthusian world. All right, this is a terrible world. Okay, this is the world through most of human history. It's not great. You barely have enough food for your family. There's disease all the time. You're lucky if you live past 10. I mean, you're lucky if you live past 5. You're real lucky if you live past 10. All right, great. Now you're an adult with no teeth. All right, that's the world. And so, yeah, but this is the Malthusian world. Okay, we don't live there. All right, here's another way to look at this. Just the English real wage. So you can see, all right, here's the Black Death, basically. Real wages go up, then there's more people, wages go back down. All right. But so here's just, I don't want to go into this in depth. Basically, this is the Black Death, basically illustrates the Malthusian dynamic. It's like this shock that half the population dies, the wages go up. And you can even see this. I'm not going to read this quote. You can feel free to read it at your leisure. But the quote is basically from like landowners who are like, they have to pay like peasants and serfs. And they're like, man, there's not a lot of peasants around. We have to pay them more. Can we get some wage controls in here so we don't have to pay them so much? Because now they're free to like try to play us against each other to get more wages because there's not that much of them. All right. And this is the world, but luckily we don't live in that world. We break out of it. Okay. So here's the escape in the 1800s, which happens for the first time in England, where we get rising population and rising standard of living. So here's the Malthusian trap, a little bit of a break out of it, fall back, and then we get the real breakout in the 1800s. This is the world we live in today, where you can have more people and higher standard of living. What a beautiful world. Thanos is wrong. Thanos is a moron. He's not familiar with history. You can have more people and higher standard of living. We're no longer limited. We're no longer limited by this zero sum game. And in many ways, more people is actually good in terms of more ideas, more innovation. And so that's a switch that gets flipped. All right. Now the U.S. Back to the U.S. The U.S. is fortunate enough to basically exist. Comes into being. Here. So it never really has this Malthusian. I mean, it has a little bit in the colonial days, but it's basically existing in this growing world. Okay, so this is how the world was. Things change in the 1800s, and the world changes into what I call like a growing pie world, from zero sum to growing pie. Doesn't mean there's still not zero sum dynamics in the present. Doesn't mean that there's extraction. That doesn't exist in the present. But we're increasingly in a growing pie world, which I will cover how that works in the next lecture. Just give an overview, and then we'll go through the explanations for why that changed. Just briefly, we're just going to briefly go over them, because like to go in depth of them would take like an entire course, essentially. Or actually, each explanation would be a big book and an entire course, maybe even an entire discipline. In fact, like development economics is an entire discipline devoted to this. Like some branches of geography that's devoted to this. All right, I'm rambling. All right, you don't want to see me ramble. I'll try to be short for y'all.